my lords and members of the House of Commons, I am deeply grateful for the addresses of condolence by the House of Lords and the House of Commons, which so touchingly encompass what our late sovereign, my beloved mother, the Queen, meant to us all. As Shakespeare says of the earlier Queen Elizabeth, she was a pattern to all princes living. As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history which surrounds us and which reminds us of the vital parliamentary traditions to which members of both houses dedicate yourselves with such personal commitment for the betterment of us all. Parliament is the living and breathing instrument of our democracy. That your traditions are ancient, we see in the construction of this great hall, and the reminders of medieval predecessors of the office to which I have been called.
All right, so let's cross live to Edinburgh, where Arise international correspondent Faith Orr joins us now. Good afternoon, Faith. How are you today? So the King has just arrived in Edinburgh. Please do bring us up to date with what's been happening.
It's a beautiful day here in Edinburgh.
Right. So please do bring us up to date with what's been happening as the King has now arrived in Edinburgh.
So yes, as you said, King Charles III has now arrived in Edinburgh. He is on his way through the city at the moment. He will arrive at the Palace of Holyrood House, which is behind me, as you can see. Now, he has made his way up from London. Earlier on, he addressed MPs, members of the House of Lords, in his first address in that position, but he has now made his way to Edinburgh with the Queen Consort Camilla, and they are on their way here. Now, they will arrive at Holyrood House. The King will address the Scottish Parliament, and they will make their way up towards St Giles Cathedral. Now, that is up the Royal Mile. So the Queen's coffin will be taken in the hearse up the Royal Mile, draped in the Scottish Royal Standard with the Scottish crown on top of it. And the King will walk behind the coffin as part of the procession. Now, that's not a very far walk up the Royal Mile, but unlike the streets of London, the Royal Mile is really quite a narrow, it's a cobbled street. It's going to be quite an intimate setting for members of the public. They really will be quite close to the new King and to the Queen's coffin. Now, the Royal Mile runs from here, the Palace of Holyrood House, all the way up to the Edinburgh Castle. St Giles Cathedral is about halfway up. It would normally take you maybe 10 minutes to walk up there. We expect it to take probably around half an hour by the time that procession slowly makes its way up the Royal Mile. Now, when it reaches St Giles Cathedral, there will be a service to celebrate the life of the Queen. That will happen at around 3 p.m. And after that, members of the public will be allowed to pay their respects to the Queen. They will be allowed to file past her coffin. I'm sure you can hear the helicopter above me at the moment. I'm sure the King is near approaching us as it stands. But members of the public later on will have that opportunity to pay their respects to the Queen for 24 hours as they file past her coffin. Of course, people of Scotland have a special place in their hearts for Queen Elizabeth II.
And we can definitely hear that activity has ramped up on your own end. But can you tell us what the atmosphere is like in Edinburgh?
There are thousands of people gathered for this procession to see the new King. It was the same yesterday. We saw thousands of people gathered. I mean, I was up the Royal Mile about maybe 4 hours ago, and there was already people standing, waiting to see the new King. Now, it's been a very warm reception. You know, the royal family spends a lot of time in Scotland, but it's not universal. We did see one protester yesterday, a 22-year-old woman, holding up an anti-monarchy sign. She has now been charged with breach of the peace. That is a fairly minor offence here in Scotland, but nonetheless that is a criminal charge against her for what many people say is simply freedom of speech. If she wants to call for an end to the monarchy, she is surely entitled to do that. But she has been charged with breach of the peace. So as I say, it's not universal, but overwhelmingly there is the sense of support in Scotland for the royal family. There was, particular love for the Queen, and I'm sure lots of people turning out to greet the new king.
Well, Faith, we know that King Charles will make Scotland's first minister. What implications could this have for the Union?
So this comes at a very interesting time for Scotland, actually, because as we know, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, has called for another independence referendum. Now, she had hoped to have that in October of next year, but Westminster, the government down in England, had said, well, no, actually, we're not going to give you permission to do so. The Scottish government has now taken that case to the courts to see if they can seek not just permission, but to see how legal it would be to hold a referendum without Westminster's approval. Now, she will be meeting with the new King, Charles III, later on today, along with other officials here in Scotland. There will be a ceremony where he is passed the keys to the city. He will almost instantly hand those keys back and say that, no, they should belong, they're best kept here in Edinburgh. Now, she will meet there, and the people I've been speaking to here, they have, as I said, they've expressed lots of love for the Queen, but many people say, well, we really like the Queen, but perhaps now is the time to reconsider the monarchy in Scotland. I don't think there'll be much disrespect, but there are a lot of questions being asked about that, and actually many people say it will bolster the case for independence because the Queen is no longer here. She was an abiding factor in the last referendum. She had expressed her wish privately that England and Scotland remain unified, that Scotland remains a part of the United Kingdom. And now that she has passed, I think sentiments here may change somewhat.
Right. Will you take us through what's going to happen in the run-up to the funeral that will take place on September 19th?
Edinburgh, Palace of
Absolutely. Well, as I said, once the Queen's coffin reaches St Giles, she will lie at rest there for 24 hours. Now, after that, she will fly back to London, excuse me, where she will then lie in state in Westminster. And then the funeral will be taking place on Monday, which is now a bank holiday. We should say that the evening before that, 8 p.m. on Sunday, a minute's silence has been declared for the whole nation. The government is asking people to observe that in their homes. If there's any social activities to be carried out, then perhaps those are paused for that minute at 8 p.m. So I think that's going to be quite a significant moment. We are still seeing crowds and crowds, thousands, tens of thousands of people piling, into London, laying tributes. People are now being encouraged not to lay tributes at Buckingham Palace, but instead to go to Green Park. And we did have a slightly unusual request from officials there earlier, which said you can continue to lay flowers, but please stop bringing Paddington bears. Of course, Paddington, one of the icons of Britain, a cartoon bear, which was part of the Jubilee celebrations, and people have been told, please stop bringing those. There's quite enough of those in Green Park, which a very, very British thing, I think.
It's a Paddington bear invasion. I want to ask about the size of the crowd that could be expected.
Yes, so in London we are expecting, just to put this into perspective, when the Queen Mother passed, 200,000 people turned out to pay their respects to file past her coffin. So we are expecting a lot more than that. It's going to be a logistical nightmare for people there. We're being told that there could be a 20-hour wait. and people are being warned that there's going to be no seats, that they're not going to be allowed to take in big bags. So it's going to be, people will turn out and they will be there, they will pay their respects to the Queen, but we are being warned it's going to be a long wait. As you can see behind me, I think we're starting to see the first of outriders arriving at the palace here, so the King should be with us just any moment now. As we wait for that, I can see crowds of, even in front of me, which wouldn't have the best view, there are just hundreds of people crowded every which way you look in Edinburgh. The Royal Mile, which is just behind me over here. So if we've got the Palace of Holyrood House here and then the Royal Mile at the other side of that, it is absolutely packed. You cannot move. Thousands of people turning out there as well. So both here in Edinburgh and in London, lots and lots of people paying their respects.
Well, Faith, apart from paying their respects, we also understand that there will be a ceremony of keys. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, so that was actually what I mentioned earlier, which was when the King meets the officials here, the dignitaries here in Edinburgh, particularly the Lord Provost, who's essentially the leader of the City Council. Now, the keys to Edinburgh will be handed to the King. It's very much a ceremonial thing. He will not retain those keys. It's a tradition that dates back quite some time. Pardon me, because of course, Holyrood House behind me is the official residence of the monarch in Scotland. Up the Royal Mile, Edinburgh Castle was the traditional home. That's where the Scottish crown is kept, which of course, as I mentioned, will be on top of the Queen's coffin. The keys will almost be immediately handed back, and the new King will tell the Provost that they are best kept for safekeeping here in Edinburgh.
All right, Faith, well, thank you kindly for that, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. As you can see on your screens, we are live from Edinburgh, where King Charles III has arrived and is currently with his Queen Consort Camilla, meeting and greeting with members of the public. And already various news outlets reporting that this is a much more subdued outing. And we can see that in the visuals compared to what we saw in London. We saw massive crowds in London. Definitely a more scanty gathering of people here, but a huge outpour of love and tribute to the Queen, nevertheless.
Well, of course, the King is heading for the Palace of Holyrood House, where the ceremony of the keys will take place. Like our correspondent told us, the occasion sees a British monarch handed the keys of the city of Edinburgh. It has traditionally marked the start of Holyrood Week, a yearly occasion which would see the then Queen visiting various Scottish regions. But today's ceremony is the first time the symbolic keys will be handed to King Charles.
And the ancient ritual, apparently, is usually performed when British monarchies arrive to stay at the palace. It involves the Lord Provost of Edinburgh offering Charles the keys to the city. And in live pictures, we see Queen Consort Camilla and King Charles III walking by an array of flowers being handed out and placed out in front of the castle. They are on what is called the Royal Mile, which also connects St. Giles Cathedral, and will be greeting individuals from Scotland who come out to pay their respects for the next few minutes.
That's right. So today is the first opportunity for well-wishers to pay their last respects at the Queen's coffin as it moves from the Palace of Holyrood House to St. Giles Cathedral. So we already know that over the next 8 days, we'll see a series of events, and that includes a service of prayer and reflection for the Queen's life at St. Giles Cathedral today. And that will be followed by a vigil, which will be held by the King and attended by other members of the royal family. Those are some of the events we look forward to seeing throughout the day today.
Well, and of course, it's been a busy morning for King Charles III and Camilla, the Queen Consort. The two started their day traveling to Westminster's Hall, where both the House of Commons and House of Lords met to express their condolences. They later travelled to Northolt in West London, where they flew to Edinburgh. And of course, just recently we saw them greeting all the crowds that are assembled outside the Holyrood Palace to pay their last respects to the Queen.
And King Charles III will walk behind his mother's coffin as it processes through Edinburgh on Monday, with thousands expected to pack the streets. And the Queen's coffin is an oak coffin. It began its final journey from Balmoral Castle on Sunday. It will be taken from the Palace of Holyrood House to St. Giles Cathedral to lay to rest. And Charles, of course, is with his Queen consort, Camilla. They are here shaking the hands and making sure that royal protocol is followed, and of course, greeting guests. Still on the Queen's coffin, it's going to be moved in a hearse, which will be flanked by the bearer of the Royal Regiment of Scotland, a detachment of the Royal Company of Archers, who are the monarch's official bodyguards in Scotland. They will also be joining the procession along the Royal Mile for the safety of the monarchs. It is expected that King Charles will follow the coffin on foot, accompanied by his siblings, the Prince Royal, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward. Camilla, the Queen consort, and other members of the royal family are expected to follow in their cars.
Yes, absolutely. So those are the activities that we look forward to witnessing today. And of course, it's 1 week to go until the funeral of the Queen. So tomorrow we will see the Queen's coffin being moved from St. Giles Cathedral to Edinburgh Airport, and then by plane will be flown to RAF Northolt. And this time around, the coffin will be accompanied by the Princess Royal, Princess Anne. And the coffin will be moved to London before 7 p.m. and then will travel to Buckingham Palace, where the King Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla will be waiting for it. So a lot of travel, non-stop. We're hearing of a vigil. It's a lot of activity for the new king, and all eyes are on him. And at the beginning of such a reign and at such an age, I'm pretty sure a lot of conversation as well around his strength and endurance for the days that are ahead of him. Of course, already portraying a strong image as we see him here standing in front of the guard, who are, of course, about to take a gun salute in his honor.
And of course, the ceremony of the keys is just about to start, which makes us the loss of his mother. He also has to perform all his duties as king. He has to comfort the nation, which just brings to mind when you hear someone is living a life of service and duty. I mean, looking at the king, you would see that this is exactly what he's doing. And of course, when he spoke to Parliament earlier today, he said he's deeply grateful for the addresses of condolences from MPs and peers, which so touchingly encompass what the Queen meant to the whole of the United Kingdom. He also made reference to Shakespeare's Henry VIII, where Elizabeth I is described as a pattern to all princes living. He says it cannot help but feel the weight of history which surrounds those in Westminster's Hall and reminds us of vital parliamentary traditions to which MPs and peers dedicate themselves.
Now, of course, all of this is happening after we saw King Charles address the Parliament for the first time, and it is said that he fought off some tears as members of Parliament and peers began to sing "God Save the King," and of course that was after, just before, he declared that he was feeling the weight of history and vowing to follow his mother's example of selfless duty during his historic address. So everybody already talking about the emotion. This is, we often forget that as much as this is a new king going through the protocol, the royal protocol, this is also a son who has just lost his beloved mama, in his words. So must be an extremely overwhelming time, but of course a time that nonetheless he has been well prepared for. So we witnessed the inspection of the Guard, of the Scottish Guard, And later on, he will be meeting with the Scottish First Minister and, of course, also the Scottish Parliament.
A role he has definitely spent a very long time preparing for indeed. Right now, there's a 21-gun salute in Edinburgh Castle in honor of the monarch, and the national anthem was played. King Charles III finished greeting the crowd and is now in Holyrood House itself. I just want to talk about the display of pomp and pageantry and protocol. It's all quite beautiful to witness, especially seeing as this will be the last queen that we see buried in our lifetimes, England. And, you know, it's quite touching. And it seems that King Charles keeps putting a special touch in being quite personable to all the individuals he's encountering, not only on the streets as he shakes their hands and accepts their flowers, also to the soldiers as we just saw him speaking to one. It is truly an interesting and beautiful display, and the ceremonies continue as they are still at Holyrood House, and King Charles is, you know, starting to first day of his reign.
And talking about being well prepared for this role at 73, you know, Prince Charles, as it was known then, was the longest serving heir to the throne. Now he's King Charles III. In his address to the nation and Commonwealth last Friday, following the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, he spoke of a desire for continuity, saying our values have remained and must remain constant. He also pledged to uphold the relationship and responsibility towards the Church of England, the church in which his own faith is so deeply rooted. King Charles has become head of the Commonwealth, an association of 56 independent countries and some 2.4 billion people. For 14 of those countries, as well as the United Kingdom, King Charles is head of state. He's set to continue his mother's commitment to these group of nations, meeting Commonwealth leaders at Buckingham Palace shortly after his accession to the throne.
That's right. Now, as much as we witness this very well-organized and well-planned and laid out protocol currently taking place on your screens, behind the scenes, of course, there is a lot going on. One of those conversations is currently a rumor that has been leaked by news website Politico, telling journalists that international leaders have been directed that they will have to fly commercial flights into London and they will be bused to Westminster Abbey for the Queen's funeral next week. So, of course, that is an unprecedented event. And we're waiting for more comments and more developments on that issue.
And it seems like the key was officially presented to the king. As we watch the ceremony proceed, he is greeting staffers who are clearly quite solemn, and as it is a solemn time, you know, the king is mourning the loss of his mother, the nation is watching the end of an era, and Scotland is welcoming back a son of its own, and he is now king. And of course, we were watching the key ceremony, the ancient ritual, usually performed when the British monarch arrives to stay at the palace. Now, it involved the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, who was on the screen earlier, offering Charles the keys to the city, which he accepted.
That's right. So just to keep you updated, of course, King Charles has arrived in Edinburgh as the procession with the Queen's coffin will continue down the Royal Mile. As it is known, earlier on he addressed both houses of Parliament, and then the Queen Consort flew to Edinburgh as well, arriving shortly after 12:30. He was welcomed on the tarmac by First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack and Edinburgh's Lord Provost Robert Aldridge. So the monarch and other members of the royal family will attend. As we see at the moment, they are entering the ceremony of the keys, and this is taking place at the Palace of Holyrood House. And we've just seen the handover of the keys to the city of Edinburgh. So after this, they will take part in the procession to the cathedral, which will host a service celebrating the Queen's life and her connection to Scotland. Of course, we know about the deep connection that the Queen had to Scotland, and I'm sure several will have fond memories to share about seeing her drive herself around the Scottish countryside.
In the meantime, a minute's silence will be held on Sunday to mourn and reflect on the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. That's according to Downing Street. The 1 minute silence will take place at 8 p.m. on Sunday night, 18th of September. That's the night before the Queen's funeral. The Prime Minister's official spokesman says the silence can be marked privately at home or with friends and neighbors, out on the doorsteps or streets with neighbors, or at any locally arranged community events and vigils. The silence is expected to be a shared national moment of reflection on the life and service of Queen Elizabeth II to the United Kingdom.
A very long life of service that she had had. Let's speak about the actual funeral day of the Queen. It's set to be a bank holiday in order of the late monarch. King Charles III formally approved an order declaring Monday, September 19th, a bank holiday at St. James' Place in London on Saturday. The Queen's funeral will take place at Westminster Abbey at 11 a.m. Now, this unexpected holiday has, of course, left Britons questioning what it means for them and their families, and a lot of them will be taking off work. The 19th will mark the 10th bank holiday that the UK would have this year. An additional one was previously added to commemorate the Queen herself back a few months ago during the Platinum Jubilee. And we are still live in Edinburgh.
Yes, of course, we can now hear the sound of the organ playing as everyone gets settled in for the service. Now, this service is going to be led by the Reverend Callum MacLeod, and of course will be attended by members of the public, friends, family members, and representatives from the charities and organizations that the Queen was affiliated to in Scotland. So I'd love the human touch to that it's not an exclusive affair for senior members of politics, or senior members of government, and royals, but beneficiaries who worked closely with the Queen as well, organizations who worked closely with the Queen, will also have this great opportunity to partake in the day's events. They say there will be airport-style security, especially later on at St. Giles Cathedral, where the public will get to view the Queen and pay their respects for the very last time. And of course, people have already started queuing up. However, she will be lying in state for 24 hours. That's to allow members of the public to pay their respects. However, at the moment, we do see members of the Scottish Parliament, of government, royal family yet to arrive at the cathedral for a service that will be led by the Reverend Callum MacLeod.
And of course, later this evening, King Charles will hold a vigil with other members of the royal family at St. Giles Cathedral, where the Queen will lie in state. The Queen's coffin will be moved tomorrow from St. Giles's Cathedral to Edinburgh Airport and then by plane to RAF Northolt. The Princess Royal, Princess Anne, will accompany the body. The coffin is expected to arrive in London shortly before 7 p.m. and will then travel to Buckingham Palace, where it will be met by King Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla. The route from St. Giles's Cathedral by road to Edinburgh Airport is yet to be announced, but members of the public will be able to view the coffin.
And just to recap the events of recently, the ceremony of the keys had just taken place. Now, it's usually an annual event. Edinburgh Lord Provost Robert Aldridge offers the keys of the city of Edinburgh to the monarch, King Charles III, welcoming him to your ancient and hereditary kingdom of Scotland. By tradition, the king acknowledges the offer, which he did so a few moments ago on your screens. He touches the keys and then says, "I return these keys, being perfectly convinced that they cannot be placed in better hands than those of the Lord Provost and councillors of my good city of Edinburgh. There was a gun salute that took place previous to that. This is the public ceremonial part of the King's visit to Holyrood House. King Charles is expected to have lunch after these proceedings are over, and the royal family will escort the coffin of Queen Elizabeth II to St. Giles Cathedral later in the afternoon.